Hey, good afternoon, everybody. A quick question. So, how many are PWA front-end developers here? Oh, very few. Okay. Series of PWA sessions with hardly PWA developers. So, what? Most of you are what? Back-end developers? How many back-end developers? Okay. Okay. Fine. Cool. Yeah. So, I'm Pradeep, and I'm going to sort of continue where Ferenc left, really, which is talk about the PWA performance, right? I mean, he's come out with some very good solution for things, but I'm going to talk about some others as well, right? So, so the problem with PWA really, right? The promise was this bed of roses, right? Okay. All advertisements said blazing fast performance that legacy technologies cannot give, right? And the reality, this is a legacy M1, this is a Google Analytics chart, legacy M1, they went to PWA Studio and their page speed, there you can see, right? And, I think that's pretty common across all PWA sites nowadays, right? So the problem really was the myth of legacy, right? What was, what is the legacy thing that you're talking about, right? So the problem is that legacy is not standing where it is, right? It's moving, right? And so, there were two technology things, maybe you want to see some monitors if you can, because this doesn't look very clear. So there was Adam Wathan who wrote the Tailwind CSS, okay? And then Caleb Pozzio wrote the Alpine JS, and Will and Wigman took all of that and made a Magento theme, which is called Hiva or Huva, right? So basically replace the Magento theme, improve page speed scores, right? And componentized UI development, right? So that's what you're facing against, right? And then there's like on-the-fly page optimizations. You had originally an idea of using Webpack to do, bundling, but now you have technologies like Nitrogen, which analyze each page on the fly and optimize it and serve it in a way that, that improves page speeds. So, for example, this site uses Huva and Nitrogen, right? And you can see the rate at which the page loads as I click, right? And so, like what you're seeing is basically, a site which was E in the GT matrix performance came down to B by just using these two technologies, right? Non-PWA, right? Yeah. So this is kalkifashion.com, Magento 2.4 with Huva and Nitrogen full page cache, right? Yeah. But there's a villain there, right? So the problem is cache miss, right? The real problem of Magento was not the the full page caching or, the problem of the Luma theme was there, but it was nowhere near compared to the problem that exists with cache misses, right? All PHP code gets executed, there's a lot of queries being run and so on. And the idea of PWA was to actually solve this problem, right? Which is like only query what you need, right? And get the data you want, right? And also dynamically load the page so that you're seeing content in the proper order, right? So from my perspective, the new PWA promise is really a platform to do more with less. For example, what he presented, to have, three of the composable products, right? And then, being able to select a lot of options. If that was to be generated in non-PWA fashion, it would have taken a lot of time, right? So, but comes back to this question, how do you fix this, right? Yeah. So I think the previous presentation gave some ideas, but let's look at some things, right? And this, right? This is the problem, right? Which was described previously, which is like, hydration, rehydration kind of thing, right? So first and foremost, right? PWA is not magic. Although the words used were magical, PWA is not magic. Just because the, information about PWA says it's lightning fast, doesn't mean it is lightning fast. It only means it has the capability of being lightning fast, right? You have to apply all your basic rules, Make sure you know your screen layout, right? Don't do like that previous slide showed, where the banner came and then it went up. Yeah, you're going to kill your CLS come what may, right? LCP is the largest contentful paint on the screen. Know what it is and make sure that gets painted first, right? Use as few fonts as possible. I've seen PWA sites with like 15 fonts, 10 fonts, and they're not going to load because the fonts won't come in time, right? And then a few more things, right? Think of the landing page and navigation, right? They're two separate things. We were sold on the click. Oh yeah, you click and it goes there very fast. That's not the thing. The thing is the landing page is important. As it previously said, you need to get good, lighthouse scores, right? For your page, you need Google Analytics scores, right? So think how Google Search Console and Google Analytics will perceive your website, right? Okay. So now how do you go about doing it, right? Let's get to the solution phase, forget the problems, right? So how do you understand the underlying technology? You need to understand what underlying technology you're using, and then you come out with solutions which are specific to that, right? So the first is like, there are a lot of native React PWA or headless sites. They use REST, they don't necessarily use GraphQL, right? GraphQL is slightly more modern and only newer stacks support it, right? So if you look at REST in Magento, the problem is that REST in Magento does not send back cacheable results, right? So you will need to figure out in your middleware how to cache the results of REST, and then comes back to the problem mentioned, which is that how do you invalidate this cache, right? How do you make sure that the tags that should have been attached actually come through? You find out what products are there within the REST. So you may have to write some custom REST to pass back the hints so that the middleware can cache it, right? Okay. Otherwise, you will be only caching based on TTL, which isn't a very good idea. Let's say you say, oh yeah, I will take the result of this category page or whatever and store it for like 5 minutes, 10 minutes. You don't know how much time you can store it for because there will be stale content coming in, right? Okay, so it will not automatically revalidate. So be aware of the technology you're using, especially REST, and understand the limitations, right? So this is another site which is REST-based with React.js, right? And they've done a very good job in making sure that the REST calls are cached properly. But this has a problem. This particular site has a problem because he's used a fixed TTL. So which means it'll work great with sites which don't have content changing regularly, products going out of stock or new products coming in. If they have like a daily schedule of putting out a product, that's fine. You can invalidate the cache, right? This uses Rendertron as SSR. So again, that also has helped the site with Google Analytics scores, right? Magento has adopted GraphQL to PWA technologies which currently use that as Candy and the PW Studio. So until 2.4.5, frankly, the Magento GraphQLs were badly designed, right? They used front-end sessions. And I think most of the developers I've talked to do not understand the problem of what this Magento sessions problem is, right? So in Magento, any backend hit, any hit that gets processed by PHP, opens the session, locks it, okay, and releases it only when it is done, right? Now imagine like I'm giving 5 or 6 or maybe 10 or 20 as in case of PW Studio GraphQL calls, right? They're all going to get sequenced, whether you like it or not, or they're going to get queued, and there's a limit of like 6 or 9 or whatever you might have set. After that, the remaining GraphQLs are going to get thrown out with the 500 error, right? So you're facing a real problem because of the design of GraphQL in Magento. 2.4.5 fixed some things, some in that, right? So basically, let's look at this. So the other one, okay, let me move to another one. This is a short time, so I've tried to compress up some slides. So post versus get GraphQL. I see a lot of, as in this particular case, I see a lot of people calling post GraphQLs, right, in Magento, right, when you only need really to call get, So the idea being that if you're calling GraphQL, make sure your GraphQL is a get GraphQL if it's a query, and use post only if it is a modification, right? So if you're not going to modify any data, not going to add to cart, there's no point doing a post on a GraphQL. In this particular site that I saw, there were 2 post GraphQLs coming, right? And each one of them, which I've put over here, but I guess seeing the monitors might be a better idea. So 2 post GraphQLs with the same parameters. Literally, I was like shocked. These 2 post GraphQLs are coming. All they're doing is trying to get the cart information, right? They're each taking some 2.5 seconds for some reason, or 3.5 seconds for some reason. Total 7 seconds. So before your page is loaded, you're gone 7 seconds down, right? Okay. The other thing is that the GraphQLs designed by Magento are not all Varnish cacheable, right? So first of all, Magento decided to use Varnish as the cache for GraphQL, right? Not just the front page cache, right? And not all GraphQLs that you can have in Magento are cacheable by Varnish, That is, Magento, the PHP end does not send back, it sends back actually no cache as a header. So it's not cacheable, right? So now there are these, lots and lots of these queries that come, every component in PWA Studio you use might end up actually using a GraphQL that cannot be cached, right? So, you see these chains, right, caused by the session thing that I told earlier, right, and the fact that things are not cacheable, right? So, what we did was we said, like, and just a reference to Siddharth, who's I think somewhere sitting in this hall also. I worked with him, and we looked at every GraphQL, and that's something which you might have to do in a PWA Studio project. Look at every GraphQL, and based on the result or based on what you're querying, identify and say that is this cacheable in Varnish or not. And if it is, right, mark it down, and you can go and actually change the VCL to make sure that you start caching this GraphQL, right? So, and the other question you have to decide is how long can you store it in Varnish, right? What is the likelihood that it might change? For example, in this case, again, you might have to look at the screens if you can, because this one's not clear enough, but there's a get root category. What is the chance of the get root category changing? Very, very low. So, okay, we said, okay, fine, let's cache this for, a day, right? I'll just skip this because I'm sure you can't read a lot, right, in what's written over here, but basically it's the output of the root category, right? Yeah, so again, this looks good. So I guess you guys can read this, right? So change the VCL and put a whole bunch of these GraphQLs which Magento generates from PWA Studio as non-cacheable from the backend, but we are saying, hey, no, we're going to cache this, right? Let's cache it for a day, which is 86400 seconds, right? And and we're basically fooling Varnish itself to saying that, okay, yeah, we're going to cache this in Varnish, right? Then the next thing is like figure out your important GraphQLs and put that in the cache warmer. So I think in the other presentation you were saying to put front-end URLs through SSR because that will generate the GraphQLs also perhaps, and it can get cached. Or you can just say that, okay, I know I have these GraphQLs which need to be cached, and write a cache warmer just to warm the GraphQLs rather than just the front end. Yeah. So one other thing we found was that there are some GraphQLs are very slow, right? And we sat down and we designed a way by which you can find out, right? So the thing is that almost every GraphQL ends up in one or more SQL queries, hopefully one SQL query, right? All front-end developers, and I know there are not too many of them over here, but front-end developers know that when I write a GraphQL, I can give it pagination information, right? When you write custom GraphQLs in backend, okay, make sure you take that information and put it down to the MySQL query as well, right? So what we do, you can identify some slow GraphQL, find out the SQL query that is generated and try and optimize it, right? So we went through a bunch of steps. We wrote down a bunch of steps that we use to identify the GraphQL and the SQL query, and then see if the GraphQL code that's written or the SQL query that you generate can be optimized. So we start with making sure that the MySQL query cache is disabled, right? Identify the GraphQL query that you want to optimize. Okay, enable the debug log, access the GraphQL. Now what will happen is that this GraphQL is going to be extremely slow because when you enable the debug log, it went and cleared a lot of caches, right? So you're going to see a lot of MySQL queries being generated. So what I like to do is then delete that debug log file and then access just this GraphQL. So obviously it has to be in an isolated environment. Access just this GraphQL, you will get the kind of query that your GraphQL generated, right? Then take that query and optimize that query, right? Yeah, so in this again, an exercise that I did with Siddharth, we found a fresh arrivals of products page, GraphQL was analyzed, it generated like 425,000 rows, right? A 20 MB data set between MySQL and PHP, right? Another category GraphQL, which was a custom, the category was a custom category. generated 259,000 rows with 13 MB dataset size between MySQL and PHP, right? In each case, the result set written, by the GraphQL itself to the front end was much lower, right? So, the query was then optimized, and then, we got, basically started taking milliseconds to execute the query, right? With 2.4.5, there is a bit of an upgrade which helps with performance, but you need to do something on the back end as well, right? Which is to generate the JWT tokens for authorization, right? So instead of using sessions for authorization, it's going to use JWT tokens for authorization. So basically, session usage has been removed from HTTP header for GraphQL in 2.4.5, right? So you don't get this chaining problem that I talked about, right? Because two JWT token GraphQLs can execute independent of each other, right? They don't need to lock a session, right? Okay, but Varnish will not work on sessions, with GraphQL queries that are made with JWT tokens because, they're not supposedly cacheable. But again, go back to the analysis, find out, oh, these are the ones which are generating JWT tokens. I see the content and I know like, hey, it's a root category, I can really cache it for a day. And make VCL changes to make sure that you cache this, right? Yeah, again, don't use post, because if you use post, it's not going to be cacheable, yeah? The other one which we experimented with was, hey, if GraphQLs can be cached in Varnish, why can't I cache GraphQLs in browser, right? After all, if you look at the PWA promise, it was this, right? Which is that there will be things which will be cached in the browser, right? And if you didn't do it in code, right, can I, as just a hosting guy, make sure that I can, get your GraphQLs which you're generating get cached in the browser, right? Again, some tricks in the VCL file, right? And for certain URLs, and these are not the exact URLs, you just made a slide over here, but basically said, okay, set the pragma to cache in the browser, right? Set the cache control to max age 300 and S max age, right, is set to 0. So that's an important thing, because what if you were to pass this entire thing through a CDN? You don't want the CDN to start caching it, right, because you have no control over it, right? You only want your browser because it's your content, not everybody's content, right? So you make sure that you set your S max age to 0 and set the max age to 300, so intermediate layer doesn't cache, browser caches it, right? Okay. So there are fancier candidates, mega menu, GraphQL, I don't know why in Magento world mega menu is considered non-cacheable, but I'd love to cache the mega menu because it's not going to change on a per page basis, for example, right? Category page, you can set it to like 5 minutes or something like that because things can change, but be very careful about one thing, currency. If your site supports currency, then that result is going to change, so don't start caching that in the browser, right? Okay. I'd actually advise if the PWA front-end developer, who are not many, so you can curse them, yeah, they write logic which decides what gets cached and what doesn't get cached in the browser, right? Okay. The GraphQLs that have absolutely no goes for caching in the browser are cart and currency stuff, right? Okay. One other thing which I see very common is that the UI builds made use a common domain for both static and non-static content. Okay, so for example, the GraphQL comes from the www, and so does your chunk.js or whatever it might be, right? Yeah. So yeah, okay, fine. I'm gone one ahead. I've been talking about another thing, which is here that IDs should be hashable, not do not generate a version strings. Right? So Magento default theme, you always see version string, right? The problem with the version string is that every time you do a deploy, it goes and clears. It basically the CDN has to cache it all over again. Your browser has to cache it all over again, and so on, right? So if you use hashes, then only the changes that you made will affect the hash, and hence only a certain amount gets invalidated in your browser, right? And also decide on bundle size, right? There are some, if you leave it arbitrary, you get large bundles, which is not going to be very good for your on-site performance, So for example, in this case, I'm not sure you can see, but there's like a whole bunch of bundles that PWA Studio generates, right? Is there a possibility that you can change? There is a possibility. There's a way in Webpack to change the size of the bundles so that you have slightly less bundles, right? Just as a note, bundles is a very complex problem, right? You might want large bundles, and you may have a lot of small bundles. Either end is a problem, so you have to manage that properly. Okay. The other one, which I was alluding to earlier, is that you need cookie-free domains. If you route everything to www, including your bundles, okay, the problem is that your CDN caching becomes a little bit more complicated, right? It's better and much easier done through Webpack to just add a public path in your output, and now you might get your output, your bundles in a different domain compared to the rest of your site. So that allows you to then only move these bundles into CDN, serve these bundles through CDN, while your main site directly gets served from your server. Yeah, yeah. And I'm here for question and answers if you have any.
Thank you so much.